What if I told you that in the heart of medieval Europe there lived a noble woman so twisted, so elegantly inhuman, that during a time of great famine she demanded peasants serve their own children as food and they obeyed? This is no Gothic fiction, this is the blood-soaked truth buried beneath the crumbling pages of forgotten chronicles. Her name was Countessette of Wallachia, and her castle stood as a symbol of refined cruelty amidst the starving cries of a dying land. Wallachia, land of forests, wolves and whispered curses, nestled between the Carpathian mountains and the river Danube. It was a principality often lost between empires and forgotten by mercy. In the early 1400s famine swept through its valleys like plague on horseback. Crops failed, cattle bones lay scattered like dice cast by death, and while villagers dug at frozen earth for roots, Countess was planning a feast unlike any the world had seen. She was born to one of the oldest noble families in the region, a lineage so obsessed with purity they'd intermarried until madness ran like blood in their veins. From a young age was taught that suffering purified the soul, but hers was a soul long devoured by shadows. Pale, poised and terrifyingly articulate, she ruled from a high stone keep above a valley of withered crops and hollow-eyed peasants, and she believed hunger was a divine instrument. When the famine reached its peak, starving families begged at her gates. She welcomed them in not with bread but with rules for every portion of grain. She demanded a sacrifice, one child per family. The villagers at first thought she meant labor. They were wrong. The first pot was served steaming at a banquet for traveling nobles, with offering it as meat blessed by necessity. The guests praised its tenderness. No one asked what it was at first. One night a mother recognized the necklace of her daughter left behind in the folds of a roasted stew. She screamed, but the Countess simply raised a glass and said, "In this world there is no place for the weak." That phrase became law in her land. She had turned starvation into selection. Those willing to give were allowed to live. Those who refused disappeared. Their homes burned, their names scraped off church walls. Rumors spread fast, but fear spread faster. The local clergy, horrified, demanded intervention. Erzsébet responded with an invitation to dine. A priest, shaking but brave, accepted. He blessed the meal, he tasted the meat. By the end of the night he wept like a child. He was never seen again, though his rosary was later found tucked beneath a dinner plate shaped like a lamb. Winter fell hard, snow blanketed the land, but it could not cover the screams. The villagers, emaciated and trembling, stopped praying for deliverance. They began to pray for forgetfulness. Still the Countess's castle glowed with candlelight. Inside music played, dancers swirled, laughter echoed over the cries outside. Wealthy lords and ladies visited from distant provinces, eager to taste the forbidden and witness the cruelty of a woman who turned famine into ritual. The kitchen became a sanctum of horrors. Her cooks, many of them orphans or slaves, prepared each dish in silence. The meat was washed, trimmed and presented with wine from Hungarian vineyards. Erzsébet demanded elegance. Even in atrocity no scream was allowed to echo into the dining hall. Only smiles, silverware and obedience. Her maids whispered prayers while seasoning. The butlers wept softly while serving. Then came the gathering, an annual event twisted from religious harvest festivals. Each family was required to present an offering of youth. Some brought their dead, others brought the living. Most brought silence, and bowed head stood above them like a statue, nodding in approval as mothers placed infants into silk-lined baskets. From sacrifice she proclaimed sprout strength through it all. Her expression never changed, cold, unreadable porcelain. She believed she was doing God's work, that by thinning the herd she saved the essence of Wallachia. Historians would later argue she was mad, but if you read the surviving letters, the chilling accounts from wandering monks and escaped servants, you'll find something worse than madness. You'll find purpose in the village of Guranagra, which once meant black throat. An old woman named Enka began carving tally marks into the bark of a birch tree, one for every child taken by the Countess. By the second winter the tree was no longer white, it wore a funeral dress of lines, crosses and broken prayers. The people no longer mourned aloud. Grief had become as dangerous as defiance, and still reigned. She wore dresses of velvet black, laced with crimson thread as if stitched from dried veins. Her dogs, massive transient hounds, were fed better than her subjects. They say she would watch them Devour seasoned flesh beside her throne, then turn to her steward and whisper. See, even beasts know gratitude. A strange transformation overtook the village. Morality warped, hunger twisted instincts. Parents began volunteering the weakest of their children, not out of cruelty but in hope that the stronger might live. What began as horror became ritual. What began as resistance became religion, and in this altar of absence, Erzsébet stood as high priestess of human despair. One boy named Callan escaped. Barefoot and frostbitten, he fled into the woods after watching his sister carried away in a sack. He wandered for 2 days before collapsing at the monastery of S. Flora, where the monks took him in. His tongue was half frozen, he could barely speak, but what he whispered into the ear of the abbot changed everything. The soup screamed. The monastery sent a scribe and a brother knight to investigate. They posed as merchants seeking favor. The countess welcomed them. She had nothing to hide because no one believed the poor. During the feast the scribe noticed strange carvings on the silver bowls, symbols of binding borrowed from old Orthodox exorcisms. The countess caught him staring. They purify the flavor, she said, smiling. That night the night vanished. The scribe found only a stained apron and a bloodworm carving knife beneath his guest bed. He fled before dawn and rode until his horse collapsed. He would later publish his journal in Prague under an anonymous name. It was banned within weeks, but not before. Rumors ignited across Eastern Europe like wildfire. Through dry wheat, nobles turned their backs. Letters from Vienna and Kiev arrived warning Erzsébet to cease, but she did not fear kings. She feared nothing. They eat ve without asking which calf, she wrote in one of her letters, yet they scorn me for making famine functional. Her defiance was not madness, it was logic sharpened by hunger. Wrapped in silk one spring when the ice cracked and the earth softened, the peasants found a buried chamber behind the stables. It held hundreds of bones, tiny bones arranged in perfect circles. Some still had red ribbons tied around them as if they had once been gifts. The countess claimed it was unwary to honor the dead. No one believed her. No one dared question her until the day of fire came. A girl named Mela, orphaned by the winter and emboldened by rage, crept into the manor at dusk. She carried only a lantern and a rusted blade. She found the kitchen empty, the fire still warm. In the pantry she found rows of hanging meats, but no pigs, no lambs, no deer, just braids of hair, necklaces of baby teeth, and one jar labeled silence. She screamed, but the walls swallowed sound. A maid found her and dragged her to the countess, who looked at the trembling child and said, "You are brave, but bravery is not survival." Mela was not executed, she was made servant, and from that day on every pot she stirred whispered back to her in voices that sounded horribly familiar. The children who survived within the castle were changed. They did not speak unless spoken to. They did not laugh, their eyes no longer blinked in rhythm with the world. They moved like shadows between halls, hands always clasped behind their backs. Mouths always closed. Some say Erzsébet taught them that speaking invites memory, and memory invites madness. Once a month Erzsébet held what she called the evening of merit. Villagers were summoned to her courtyard. Those who had given the most children livestock tools were allowed to step forward and receive a blessing, a slice of warm bread dipped in broth. The others watched empty-handed as the bread vanished into trembling mouths. A lesson, she claimed, a holy ritual of discipline. But within the silence something stirred. Among the broken, a man named Yosef, once a school teacher, began scribbling messages on the inside of barn doors. He wrote of resistance, of hidden grain, of courage returning. His words were short and sharp, carved with broken nails, smeared with soot and blood. He became a ghost with a voice, a whisper in the night that said, "She can bleed." Erzsébet noticed, she always noticed, but instead of punishing the village she staged a new game. She called it the trial of faith. Each week a family was chosen at random. One member was locked in a wooden cell with a bowl of food and a knife. The food was real, the catch, the knife was poisoned. If they ate they would live, if they shared they would both die. She said it was an experiment in virtue. The villagers called it damnation. One day a wandering minstrel arrived at the village gates. He was blind, dressed in patchwork, and claimed to bring news from the Pope. He sang of stars falling and beasts rising. Seat invited him in, curious. During his performance he paused, tilted his head and whispered toward her throne, "Even you cannot eat your way out of Judgment. She smiled that night he vanished but his lute remained, its strings snapped and soaked as time dragged forward. The seasons lost their names, the villagers no longer said spring or autumn, they said the season of meat, the season of ash. Language itself began to bend beneath the weight of horror. Children born during the famine were never named. They were numbers whispered in code by mothers too afraid to love what could be taken. Then in the dead of a blood orange twilight, smoke rose from the monastery of Stilora. Bandits, or so it was claimed, had raised it, but some survivors whispered another story, that the Countess had ordered its destruction after the abbot declared her excommunicated. Her soldiers burned holy texts, shattered relics and nailed crucifixes upside down above the ruins. Faith, she said, is only as strong as its fire. The rumors reached Bucharest, but the rulers, distant and embroiled in their own wars, ignored them. Wallachia was a wild province best left to its own madness, and Erzsébet paid her taxes. Gold after all shines brighter than screams. The silence of kings became her sanctuary, yet within her own halls cracks formed. Servants began dropping dishes, maids forgot prayers, dogs refused to enter certain chambers. One cook swore she saw a child's face in the soup. Blinking, another hanged herself in the larder, carving a single word into her arm: forgive. Dismissed it all as hysteria, but even she began locking her doors at night. The castle had begun to whisper. Stones moaned, doors sighed, mirrors reflected rooms that didn't exist, and deep beneath the kitchen, in a sealed crypt no one remembered building, there was a sound like breathing, but slower. She sent guards to investigate, they never returned. Only the echo came back, and the echo said her name. One evening the Countess stood alone in her grand hall, staring into a mirror that no longer reflected her face. Instead it showed the courtyard filled with children staring back, silent and still, their eyes hollow as burnt-out stars. She shattered the glass with a candelabrum, but the next morning the mirror was whole again, and the children were closer. Desperate to regain control, Erzsébet ordered a festival, not of meat, not of merit, but of music. She summoned fiddlers, dancers and acrobats from across the principality. The villagers were forced to attend. Wine flowed, fireworks cracked, and yet no one smiled. The music sounded like mourning, the dancers moved like marionettes, and the Countess at the center spun endlessly until she collapsed, vomiting blood shaped like a hand. That night she dreamed of a banquet where she was the main course. Her guests were faceless, their teeth glistened like knives. She awoke in a cold sweat, her sheets soaked in salt. Her maids found her sitting at the foot of the bed, eyes wide, whispering, "The silence is eating me." More servants fled, horses were found dead, tongues cut out, the well turned black, the orchard bore fruit shaped like limbs. A noble who visited claimed the wine tasted like tears. He never returned home. Erzsébet accused the village of witchcraft and had 10 elders hanged upside down in the square. Their bodies swayed in rhythm with a wind that no one felt. In her final attempt to restore order, she summoned the last known witch of the marshlands, an old blind woman named Baba Mila. You have stirred the bones, the crone said upon entering, and now they stir you. See, demanded protection. Baba Mila smiled, toothless and sad. There is no protection, she said, only payment. The Countess offered gold. Mila laughed. She offered blood. Mila shook her head. Finally she asked, what do you fear most? Paused, her voice cracked. To be forgotten. Mila nodded and said, then you shall live forever. In screams. That night the witch vanished, but the sound of whispering children echoed through the castle louder than ever. The villagers, now gaunt, near mad, began digging graves for themselves. They no longer hoped for salvation, only an end. Yosef the teacher was caught one night writing the words, she is not death, she is hunger. Given a crown, he was dragged before Erzsébet, who asked him why he kept resisting his answer. Because someone must remember how to be human instead of executing him. She kept him alive, caged like a bird, forced to write praises of her each day. Pages and pages of lies, but he wrote one truth on his own skin, carved with a spoon handle. Hell is not fire, hell is watching and doing nothing. Eventually even his scream stopped. Winter returned, but this time there was no meat, no grain. No more children, only silence and snow. The Countess wandered the halls, hallucinating faces in the frost. She tried to sing but forgot the words. She Tried to pray but remembered no gods, only the taste, only the smell, and then nothing. The final day came quietly, the castle gates were open, the courtyard empty, her throne stood bare, the villagers found in the kitchen seated beside the fire, her hands submerged in a boiling cauldron. She was smiling, her last words spoken to no one and everyone were, "At last I am full." They buried her without ceremony, no priest, no hymns, just cold hands and colder dirt. The castle was sealed with chains, the doors bricked shut. The villagers left crosses upside down at the gates, not as a curse but as a warning: do not open, do not enter, let her rot beneath her hunger. But she did not rot. Days later, when storms unearthed her grave, the body was gone, no tracks, no signs of animals, just an empty coffin lined with claw marks on the inside. Some said she had risen, others believed she had never truly died. Either way, the castle stood silent but watching. For decades no one dared approach the ruins, the forest swallowed the path, maps erased the name, birds avoided the trees, but the children of Wallachia still whispered her name when fires burned low, and sometimes during famine meat would appear mysteriously in the village square, warm, wrapped in velvet. A century later a team of foreign scholars came searching for the truth. They excavated the cellar and found bones, hundreds of them arranged like prayers with tiny symbols carved into each femur. They found portraits where eyes had been scratched out and a journal written in 3 languages none had ever seen. They published none of it. The lead scholar returned home with a small token, a silver spoon from the countess's kitchen. Weeks later his wife disappeared, then his child, then his dog. They say he was found one morning chewing on his own hand, muttering, "She's still hungry." The spoon was missing. The case was never solved. Erzsébet of Wallachia became legend, then myth, then something more. Her story morphed, told in taverns, scratched on prison walls, whispered in soup kitchens, a warning, yes, but also a mirror, because the true horror wasn't her cruelty, it was how quickly desperation made her cruelty possible. Centuries passed, wars came and went, kingdoms rose and fell, but in every famine struck village, in every starving eye there lingered a flicker of her presence, not physical, not ghostly, but psychological. That deep question, what would you do to survive? And in that question she lived on. In recent times a researcher uncovered the original edicts signed by her. They were cold, mathematical, written like accounting sheets: 1 child, 2 weeks, grain, 1 sibling, 4 servings, no emotion, just numbers, just hunger. The researcher burned the papers afterward. He said he heard crying in the ink at the monastery ruins of Estiflora, now reduced to moss and ruin. 1 wall still stands, carved into the stone, faded by rain and time. As a single phrase she wore famine like a crown beneath it, a small handprint no larger than a child's. No one knows who made it, no one wants to. And so we tell her story, not to glorify, not to indulge, but to remind. Power unchecked becomes appetite, and appetite unchecked becomes legend. Erzsébet of Wallachia is not a ghost, she is a question, a silence, a mirror. And when the world forgets how quickly hunger twists the soul, she returns dressed in velvet, smiling. Centuries from her death, Erzsébet remains unnamed in most official records. The church calls her the devourer. Historians label her the Countess of Silence, but the people of Wallachia know the truth in their lullabies. They still warn children not to cry at night, or she will hear you and she will feed. Her castle, though mostly in ruins, still stands. Ivy has reclaimed the walls, the gate is rusted shut, yet tourists claim to hear clinking cutlery behind the stones or smell soup in the air despite the wind. One visitor recorded laughter, soft, high-pitched, and unmistakably not human. He deleted the recording, but he never deleted the memory. Among the archives of lost noble houses there lies a strange family tree, the Drakowski, the base rab, and at the edge Dravaga crossed out in red. No children, no heirs, no marriages, just one branch circled in ink, labeled fed by ashes. The ink appears wet even after centuries. In psychology her name appears as an archetype, the Erzsébet complex, when controlled deprivation and isolation lead to moral collapse. Soldiers trapped in siege, refugees in camps, survivors on lifeboats, they all echo her logic and whispers, "It is better one dies than many, it is better to eat than be eaten." A modern artist once tried to recreate her dining room. She replicated every candle, every knife, every plate, but halfway through the installation she stopped. She claimed the walls began weeping, her studio flooded with saltwater. She now paints only in white. When asked why, she said, "I've seen enough red." Even now, in times of crisis, political leaders reference the famine throne, a term born from Erzsébet's legend. It means ruling by fear disguised as necessity. It means enforcing survival through suffering. It means looking into the eyes of the starving and calling it policy. In literature, her shadow reappears again and again, the cold woman, the velvet tyrant, the host with no heart but none dare name her fully. To name her is to remember is to risk summoning the part of us that agreed with her, that nodded along when she said, "This is the price of order." Because deep down the Torah isn't just her existence, it's our reflection in her. She didn't descend from monsters, she rose from people, fed by permission, justified by famine, decorated by wealth. She is what happens when systems choose efficiency over empathy, and once chosen, that path cannot be easily unwalked. So yes, Eret of Wakia was real, whether as a woman, a monster, or a metaphor. She left her mark not just in bones but in behavior, in every equation that weighs life against necessity, in every policy that sacrifices the voiceless for the powerful, in every dinner table too quiet to be clean, and perhaps the most haunting truth of all, she no longer needs to return because we kept her alive, not in body, not in castle, but in the decisions we make when pressed, when starved, when afraid. She is not history, she is prophecy, and we are still writing her next chapter years later, when a famine swept through another land, distant, modern, televised. An aid worker found a child clutching a journal. It was written in a language the worker didn't recognize, but the drawings were unmistakable. A throne made of ribs, a woman with no eyes, a bowl that never emptied. The child had never left their village. And yet, when asked who the lady was, the child replied in perfect Wakian, "She watches who is still hungry." In elite mice, some professors dare include her in forbidden philosophy lectures. They present her logic as a thought experiment. What would you sacrifice to save the majority? But the classroom always grows cold, not from air, from implication, because the more you study her, the more you realize she didn't create cruelty. She clarified it. One theologian suggested that Erzsébet wasn't evil but merely efficient. She embodied utilitarianism without restraint, he wrote, and in doing so she showed us the line between civilization and savagery is not light but food. He was dismissed the following year for quoting her writings in a public forum. The backlash was swift. The question remained there: are survivors even now descendants of those who lived through her reign? They do not tell bedtime stories, they plant trees, they speak kindly, they overcook meals because somewhere deep in their blood they remember the taste of what wasn't supposed to be eaten, and they refuse to let silence return. A century from now her story may resurface again. Not as horror, not as myth, but as precedent in times of climate collapse, political upheaval, or digital dehumanization. Her logic will become seductive once more, cold, clean, calculated. She offers not salvation but order, not kindness but clarity. That is her danger, that is her appeal. And so we must remember not to fear her but to fear becoming her, to fear the moment when we too begin to see sacrifice as strategy, when empathy feels inefficient, when we label hunger as weakness. That is when her footsteps echo loudest, not in the past, in our decisions, in the quiet hours of winter nights near hearths or empty fridges. People still murmur her name, not aloud but inwardly, in shame, in warning, in recognition, because even if her castle crumbles, even if her bones remain scattered, the structure she built was never made of stone, it was made of choices, and those never die. They say that in Wakia the wind still sings her melody, a lullaby with no words, just hunger and harmony. Travelers claim that on certain nights the trees seem to lean inward, as if listening, as if waiting, as if remembering, because the land itself was fed too long on fear to ever forget her. And if you find yourself alone, deciding between comfort and conscience, between silence and outcry, between watching and acting, remember her not as a ghost, not as a monster, but as a mirror, for she is what rises when compassion dies, what smiles when morality starves, what survives when humanity doesn't. So light your fires, share your bread, speak loudly, and never ever let your hunger choose for you, because in every famine, literal Or moreover there waits a countess and she only needs one silence to feast. Again.